Well, welcome everybody to this plenary number 4 of the What Works Summit organized by the GDN and the Campbell collaboration. I'm glad to have with me on this panel distinguished and experimented developmental actors from the university and think tank and academia sphere. And what we will be discussing for a little bit more than an hour is what is the whole, is there a place for a Southern-driven development research agenda, and what it means in practice, how it works, what are the experience that our panelists can share, and also they will share with us their perspective for the futures and recommendation. So we have a great group. Andrea comes from a network of think tanks. She's director for the Southern Voice, a network of think tanks working at the global level, trying to influence the debate at the UN and the G20, G7, coming basically representing the global South. We also have Yamini, with the very strong experience in India, Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, great experience also at the intersection of research and policy making, and she will share her experience in a large emerging market of the South with important challenge and complexities. We also have Celia, works on Asia, president of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, which is a government think tank, works on development. So I think it's important to have various perspectives. Think tanks, academia, and research institutions have a there's no homogeneity, and many institutions with the specificity, and that's what we're trying to get at here. Ernest, which comes from a university background, he was the Secretary General. This is the Secretary General of the African Research University Alliance, and former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Ghana. So we'd be coming with a slightly different background, more academic and research oriented from an African country. So it's a nice combination of continents, Africa, Asia, Latin America, that we have in this panel. So let me start maybe for each of you with 5 minutes. If you can share how can we spread the culture, the think tank culture and academic. When I say think tank, you should understand research institution at large, which with an applied mandate, I would say, and how we can increase their visibility, how these institutions can help and structure their credibility with respect to policy makers, and how basically at the global level, those think tanks and research institutions, wherever they are, at universities or also with governments, can help structure constructive dialogue in their specific countries, but also at the global level. So let me start with as the order I have here in the panel with Andrea for 5 minutes, please. The floor is yours, Andrea.
Thank you, Karim, and good morning, evening, afternoon to everybody joining us. And I will start with your question from your last question at the global level, given the expertise of Southern Voice, that we're a network of think tanks working at the global level. I thought that maybe what we should start with is unpacking a little bit this concept of Southern-led research and what we mean when we're talking about Southern-led research. And that really comes up when we are having these discussions at the global level, and we're seeing research vis-a-vis what is being produced in the global north. And I think that beyond just saying that it's research that comes from countries in what we usually call the global south, Southern-led research is that one that really acknowledges these power dynamics, these unequal power dynamics that exist in the world between North and South, and also within the countries in the global South. And I think another important aspect in this setting the scene of what we're talking when we think about Southern research is that many times we tend to confuse this with being Southern-led research with being local research. And while I agree that many of the researchers that are in the Global South are very well positioned to carry out research in their own local context, this is not the only value of the research produced in the Global South. And the research in the Global South has the potential to be relevant for also different contexts. And I think we've learned that from our experience also now seeing the research produced by our members in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and realizing that there are many lessons to be learned across these regions, right? So it's many times we tend to say that Southern-led research and the value of Southern-led research is within its capacity to understand the local context well. But I think we should go beyond that and also think about how Southern-led research can really be informative for other contexts and at the global level as well. So I think that's the other aspect that it's important to reflect on when we're talking about Southern-led research. And in this context, at the global level, I think it's important in your question regarding how to promote more the think tank, the evidence-based culture, is that researchers and experts across the global South see themselves also as what Diane Stone calls transnational policy professionals, meaning that they see their work relevant for other countries and that they see themselves also as actors that can interact with policymakers and experts from other countries and other regions beyond their national borders. So I think that's where I would like to start with the session and hear from the rest as well.
Thank you, Andrea. Let's move to Ernest now. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Karim. Thank you very much. I agree entirely with most of what Andrea has said. In my perspective, getting think tanks to be taken a bit more seriously, it requires that think tanks need to make the case that policy making requires evidence. In many parts of the developing world, governments are yet to accept the fact that policy making is best done when there's evidence to support it. And so it's our responsibility as researchers to push for a general acceptance, not just by the governments in our countries, but also by the general public, the need for evidence in the policy making. Once that is done, the question becomes, how do we increase the visibility of think tanks? How do we ensure that the quality of the work that we do is such that it can be used for proper policy making? Over here, I think it's important that the universities, think tanks all work together, focused on how to improve on the quality of what we do. I've seen various examples of capacity building within think tanks. I've seen a lot of effort being made by governments to enhance the way think tanks in the South operate. How do we ensure that it hasn't been easy, largely because you have in many countries standalone think tanks. It's extremely difficult to find a think tank that is effective if it is working alone. And that takes me to the final point I want to make here in terms of how do we ensure that the think tanks in the developing world, especially here in Africa, are more effective. Collaboration is the way to pursue this. Partnerships are the way to ensure that this happens. And one example that I'll give you is with the network that I work, the African Research University Alliance. We are about equality. We are about ensuring that there's equity in the way research is organized around the globe. We are about how to ensure that the voices of African researchers resonate in the discussion of global matters. So we have, as an alliance, brought together 16 universities because we believe that as individual universities, it's extremely difficult to make our voices heard. By having a think tank, by having a group, a network, an alliance, is a lot easier. So we are able to engage with the British government through UKRI. We are able to engage with the European Union and so on as a collective. And that's what I think Africans should be doing, and indeed in the entire developing world. Working as groups, working as networks, being able to use a collective voice ensures that we are able to set the research agenda for Africa. When we engage with the UKRI, for example, we are not obliged to work with a particular UK university, as would have been the case otherwise. We work as a collective. We decide what research we want to do. We receive funding from outside for research that we want to do. And as a result of this engagement with the outside world, we are also taken a lot more seriously by the governments in the region. So in ending my short contribution here, I believe strongly that collaboration is the way forward, collaboration in which equity and equality are key vital points is really the way to pursue the agenda of making our voices heard and ensuring that the research agenda for the South is determined by the people of the South. Thank you.
Please go ahead, Yamini.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege for me to be part of this discussion. And I think in some ways, I of course completely endorse what my other two panelists before me have said. And in so many ways, discussions like this are exactly the platforms that we need to be able to both build credibility, but more importantly, shape narratives, build collaborations, and linkages between think tanks across the globe. Karim, in fact, just before we went live, we both made contact with each other and said to ourselves, why is it that we haven't interacted with each other before as institutions? So I think, part of that sort of answers one of the questions: how is it that we can better sort of push voices of the multiplicity of think tanks, of research institutions, and public policy actors, on the global stage. And I think one of the challenges, with the exception of Southern Voice, there are very few platforms where we actually get the opportunity to interact with one another, to learn from one another, and most importantly, also to share our own experiences, tools, and techniques with each other. And the absence of these platforms is something that is felt very deeply. So the first most important step forward, I think, it would be for there to be more platforms that would allow for just collaborative interaction with the communities of think tankers and researchers across different regions in the world. Andrea, over to you to expand the network of Southern Voice, because without that, the spaces for us to engage are quite limited, and I think that we feel the loss of that very substantively. I think I wanted to say two more things. One, to the question of how does one make the think tank culture more widespread? I think part of the challenge is that the word think tank, the nomenclature think tank, is relatively new, and it's sort of been used as an umbrella that sort of cuts across a very diverse group of organizations, institutions, and individuals. And in each country setting, the particular role that policy research and think tankers play, very often is designed in a way that responds to the peculiarities of that country setting. So in India, for instance, the think tanks in some ways have emerged as a response to the complete atrophy of the university. So we end up being far more academically research oriented, generating new knowledge, asking the big questions in ways that think tanks don't necessarily do in many other parts of the world, because university research centers fulfill that role. And we are sort of being pushed often to ask ourselves, you can't replicate the university when you're not in a university, so step out and ensure that the research that you're doing actually engages with the policy world. So the credibility question has a lot to do with the particular context within which think tanks emerge. And I think building out the much more innovation of the ways in which think tanks or research, policy research actually shapes the space of policy is important. And here, one of the big challenges that I think many countries across the globe are facing is that the public sphere is itself becoming so deeply polarized that at some level, the role that we play is becoming even more central, because you need evidence, rational judgment, argumentation in the context of a very polarized public sphere. But at the same time, prizing open that space for evidence-based, rational, careful, good judgment argumentation is much more limited. So, the credibility question becomes crucial, because we, at some level, not only have to fight for relevance. Why is it important that think tanks and policy research play a role of the nature that we do within the public sphere, but also fight to preserve the spaces that we have? So I think any discussion on credibility of think tanks must take into account the particular moment that the globe finds itself in the trajectory of its own democracy and shaping of the relationship between state and people, and that in many ways is turning the question on its head. Is it that we need to create space for credibility, or is it that we need to fight for space for evidence, rational judgment, and effective argumentation within the public sphere? And each of these will, the ways in which we choose to answer this, I think, will shape how we shape our role within the public sphere and position ourselves even in the context of academic research. So it's just something for us to think about and debate in the course of our discussion today. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Yamini. And let's move to Celia from Philippines, please, as your introductory remarks to the discussion.
Thank you, Karim. I'd like to share the perspective of government think tank. And I think to make think tank culture more widespread in the South, they can work towards being integral part of the policy-making process. And they can do that by doing research on domestic and international policy issues that are of key importance to their policymakers. I think that think tanks should be up to date on current domestic and international policy issues, and they should be able to demonstrate how important these policy issues are to the country. Moreover, the think tank should also be forward-looking and be cognizant of emerging policy concerns. This would allow them time to conduct the research and be ready to provide recommendations when the policymakers are confronted with a policy issue. Then the policymakers would get used to receiving recommendations and advice from think tanks. And to ensure policy relevance, I think it would be best if think tanks develop research agenda in consultation with government and other stakeholders. This would ensure buy-in from the decision makers. For instance, in the case of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, which I headed until 2 months ago, we formulate 5-year research agenda on social economic policy issues based on review of current and emerging policy issues and and consultation with different stakeholders. This agenda is updated every year through our annual research planning workshop to be able to take into account new developments. And this research agenda is not just for PIDS, but for the research community in the Philippines. And to foster think tank culture, it's also useful to have open conversations through fora, conferences, and and allowing various stakeholders to participate in the conversations, to hear about different views and come up with evidence-based and actionable recommendations. Think tanks can also provide the platform for discussion of different views on the matter, and this ensures that the policy decisions are based on evidence. Based on our experience, the pandemic provided PIDS an opportunity to broaden its reach. Before the pandemic, we would have to hold face-to-face in-person conferences and policy fora where most of the participants would come from the capital, and we would have a few events outside the capital. During the pandemic, we held weekly webinars to share findings and recommendations of our policy researches, and we noted increased attendance from stakeholders outside the capital and also bigger audiences on our conferences and streaming platforms. This provided an opportunity to expose more policymakers and the general public to the contributions of think tanks in the policy process. And to increase visibility, we also found that actively pursuing partnerships with government agencies to undertake research that are of paramount importance to them made them aware of our existence and the work we do. In a matter of few years, government agencies would approach us seeking to collaborate with us. They identify the policy issue and provide the financial resources while PIDS undertakes the actual conduct of the research. One thing that we also found useful in this collaboration is that it provided an avenue for prioritizing some of the policy concerns of the government agencies. They were willing to consider other policy issues aside from the initial policy issue that they were interested in. And one thing we noted in working with policymakers is the importance of persistence. Our recommendations may not be accepted or acted upon immediately by policymakers. Thus, think tanks need to be persistent in pushing for certain ideas. Based on my own experience, we have been advocating for a community-based monitoring system to provide the needed disaggregated data for improved local governance, rational allocation of resources, and more targeted responses. It took over 20 years before the Philippine government adopted our recommendation and institutionalized it nationwide with the enactment of a law, but we persisted, and this was possible also with the support of the International Development Research Center that enabled us to demonstrate the usefulness of the system to local governments, who then adopted it even without the national government mandating it. It was really an undertaking from the bottom up with the pressure coming from local governments to institutionalize it and recognize the data coming from CBMS as part of official statistics. And at this point, we are advocating this to the global community as well. And I think one last point that I'd just like to highlight is that this is where global networks such as the GDN and its regional networks, for instance, the East Asia Development Network or EADN, the network of East Asian think tanks, and other similar networks and research networks such as the Partnership for Economic Policy or PEP, which I was involved in, play an important role in providing a stronger voice for Southern-based think tanks. These are some of the networks that I have been involved with, and based on my experience, as mentioned also earlier, networks can provide the platform for exchanging ideas and bringing together Southern researchers to promote collaboration. So perhaps I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. Thank you to all of you. I propose that you delve a little bit more on this dimension, local versus global. Because when we say Southern-led development agenda, we mean sort of changing the narrative at the global level. We mean changing the narrative at the global level, which is one thing, influencing ideas, multilateral institutions, etc. But at the same time, economic policy, development policies, the challenges are at the local level. How do you deliver education, etc. So how do you deal with this double dimension? Trying to shape the global agenda and at the same time trying to develop a purposeful agenda which is targeted to a specific country, to a specific region. As we all know, they are not sort of one size fits all in developmental policies. There are many, it's so specific to different places, culture, etc. So how you deal with this at your different institutions? Let me start with Ernest, maybe, and how you're relevant also, I would say, at this double dimension, or do we need to have specific institutions? So, Ernest, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Karim. It's a very, very important question. And I can answer that using the SDGs as an example. Today, we know that every single country in the region, whether in Africa or Asia, Latin America, that aspires to attain the SDGs will require new ways of doing things, new ways of delivering water, new ways of delivering health, new ways of delivering education. Everything has to be done differently from what used to be the case before. To do all those new things, you need new knowledge. You need to do new research. So it's important that researchers in the region are able to influence not only what happens in their country, but also across in neighboring countries, across in the rest of the world. The health challenges of Africa today are transnational. They go across borders. The pandemic has shown us that. What it tells me is that not a single African country can deal with its health challenges working alone. So as an organization, I think about how the researchers in my country can work with researchers in another country. So whether they are in Nigeria or they are in Senegal, they are in Uganda, it means a lot that bringing them together is the way to go. And it's only when they come together that they can also then begin to think about how to have a global voice. How do we ensure that discussions globally about health in Africa takes into account the African voice, that African health researchers are at the table, and they can do this when they work together. So let's talk about malaria. Malaria research in individual countries has been going on for many, many years, but we haven't had any say in the development of malaria vaccines. Yet there are many Africans who are involved in malaria vaccine research. How do you bring them together to have a say in the malaria vaccine research agenda? And this means that the WHO must begin to pay attention to them. So whenever we talk about networks, when we talk about working in groups, the whole idea to have a critical mass of people in the region whose work cannot be ignored by the world, who will have a say in how global decisions are made. There's absolutely no way we can find a proper vaccine for malaria without an African researcher or African researchers at the table. It's not going to happen. Today, we all seen what we call the apartheid with the vaccines for COVID-19. It is so because African voices were not at the table at the beginning. How do we change that narrative? We can change that narrative by working together. Once we understand that our national problems do not confine themselves only to our nation, but are also found across the borders, and they are indeed transnational. And so we must work across borders. We are not going to find solutions. So my encouragement to all think tanks in Africa, around the world, is learn to work with others. Learn to work with others across your borders. Let's work with other researchers working on similar themes in different countries. Then you can begin to affect the way the discussions are held globally, whether it's in water, whether it's in energy, climate change. We need to work across borders.
Thank you. Let me turn to Yamini on the same issue, local versus global, but also what kind of autonomy you need to build your own research agenda, which is relevant. Do you think we have, this is, we have wide possibilities, or this is constrained, there's no autonomy to build this specific research agenda, both at the local and national, I would say, at global and local levels?
Thanks, Karim. I think three things that I'd like to say in response to this. One, I think that there is no shaping of global agendas, particularly the global public goods that are now at the core of the development discourse, take climate change as an example, without actively recognizing the relevance and centrality of sort of developing country, southern country. Why I hate all these terminologies, but nonetheless, without recognizing the unique realities of the diversity of nations that make the global the global world, and no one particular perspective, say a Western perspective, will necessarily be able to solve those global challenges if it doesn't actively understand, engage, and bring the bulk of the globe into a participatory discourse. Otherwise, we'll end up precisely where the challenge of global development has found itself, of aid being given with a very specific prefixed understanding of what the pathways of development are, but that not necessarily yielding the outputs and outcomes that that were imagined in the first place. And as the world is more deeply interconnected and interlocked, events in one part of the world shape the overall trajectory of the globe. So the need for us to have a collective, participatory, much more democratic making and shaping of the global discourse is crucial. And in that, researchers, think tanks play a very, very important role, because think tanks are as institutions designed to have the luxury to push and ask the right questions and shape research and evidence agendas. So I think we have a really crucial responsibility to draw on our own expertise and knowledge bases that we acquire in the country context in which we are located to really push hard to shape global agendas. And part of that shaping of the global agenda is to push global governance institutions to open up, to be more democratic, to be more participatory, and to offer the space for a voice. So the very same sort of battles of accountability and participation that we fight within our own nations vis-a-vis citizen-government relationships also need to be fought in shaping the architecture of global governance institutions. And it's high time that global governance institutions themselves wake up to the need for a different kind of decision-making structure that brings that creates more participatory spaces for voices that reflect the diversity of developmental experience across the globe. That's one part of the challenge. The second part of the challenge is actually for global aid to recognize that the trajectory that they are going down is actually undermining the autonomy and the ability of institutions that they collaborate with and that they support to make and shape agendas in the following way. In the sort of, if you look at the evolution of philanthropy, particularly now the emergence of private philanthropy as a very, very critical part and parcel of the overall global philanthropy that shapes research agendas, think tanks, civil society communities, as well as governments. The trajectory of philanthropy has moved away from building institutions towards identifying very specific problems and wanting to projectize how they support efforts at finding solutions to those problems. It essentially means that the resources are coming attached to a desire to solve a problem rather than building an institutional ecosystem to define and solve a problem within their specific country context. So when you stop building institutions and start looking towards a very finding causality between giving money and solving a problem, you completely undermine the ecosystem that you need to build to be able to generate genuine understandings of the developmental challenges and finding local solutions. In the old days, if you look within India, actually, just at our entire sort of research and think tank ecosystem, in the 70s and 70s through the 90s, actually, over a good 25-30 year period, you will find that a lot of the institutions for research, higher education, even institutions like the one that I'm representing, Center for Policy Research, all flourished through global philanthropic support that came into us as core institutional support. You made a bet on the idea of an institution, and you allowed the institution to go out, build its institutional backbone, and build an ecosystem that could generate a certain sort of knowledge environment that would shape policy. In today's world, all the funding comes attached to a specific project. It doesn't actually allow you to build institutional backbones. So inevitably, perhaps without meaning to, the autonomy and flexibility of institutions to shape research agendas for themselves, to build the strength within the institutional environment to be able to attract long-term talent, ask difficult long-term questions, and use their own innovations then both to respond to the unique local challenges as well as shape global agendas, gets restricted. We can't talk about participatory, democratic global governance without looking at the dynamics of philanthropy. Ultimately, the global and the local work closely together, and the global has to recognize that the resourcing of the local has to be done in ways that genuinely support institution building, not projectizing. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Yamini. Let's hear from Andrea, who has a global view with her network of think tanks.
Thank you, Karim. I think Ernest and Yamini have made really important points in this last round about the way to go about it, and I would just like to build on that. I think that one additional thing that we should do is think about what we need to do as researchers and policy experts in the Global South do around building this notion of the Global South. And I love that in the case of Africa, more and more researchers take this jump of not talking only about their country, but about the continent as a whole. And I think that is a good thing that the rest of the regions we should look into and stop seeing just the work in our specific countries. And I think one of the things that we need to start doing to do so is really start reading each other's work, following each other's work, citing each other's work. So through Southern Voice, we've hosted this COVID-19 hub, which contains more than 700 resources from our members. And it's been a unique experience for us at the Secretariat to be fortunate to be receiving constantly such interesting research that is being produced across the regions and seeing how well it is connected. And we just need to do that more. We need to realize that we are, constant. If we don't take this proactive approach, the system, all the social media, the big academic institutions and publishers and so on will keep us feeding more and more the research that is produced in the global north. And in that context, it's difficult to build this notion of the global south. So I think we all need to kind of like take these personal commitment even to get to know, read, and learn more about what our colleagues in other regions of the global south are doing. And I think that would make a big difference in building this notion of global south and building these networks, these connections, these collaborations that all my co-panelists have also mentioned. And then my second point, in addition to
Andrea, let me push you a little bit on that before you do your second point. Why are you saying we should read more? The southern research, so to speak. You are saying that most of the researchers in the global south were not reading their own research or the research of their peers. So why is it that? And
well, I've come to do this with certain frequency, where I see what documents researchers are citing in their documents, right? And a lot of the times they're citing researchers from the global north, and so that gives you a sense of. Sorry.
I'm just asking why. I mean, Bandung is 1955. We're almost 60, 70 years past that. So, what's your take on that? I mean, why is it so?
I think that it's difficult to change a paradigm. So I've been working in Southern Voice for the last 8 years. And when I started, the first time I started working with think tanks in Africa, in Asia, it was brand new for me, having been a think tanker in Latin America. And when we were looking, even in the think tank where I was working, at other peers, maybe we were thinking about the region, but we were looking at, the notion of the think tanks that you have, the big names in the global north. It's difficult to change these dynamics. So that's why I think we have to be, we have to acknowledge that these dynamics exist and take proactive approach to changing them. And I think that we'll realize how much we have to learn about what other researchers are doing in the topics that we're working on, right? So, for example, in the issues of food security that were very, very alive during the COVID debate, it was so interesting to see so many of our researchers touching on innovative solutions at the local level around markets and around community opportunities for feeding and so on. And they were all working on their local context and finding it difficult to know, feeling a little bit alone because they're doing these, because in the global north, the markets were not a big concern. But actually, when you look at markets in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, a lot of them were having these problems of lack of sanitary, standards and so on. So there is a lot that we can learn when we actually take some time to read each other's work.
Thank you, Andrea. Let me now ask a question from our audience. There's a question from Ferdinand Bakoup. How would the Southern-driven development research agenda be different from a Northern-led research agenda in terms of topics studied, for example? And are there really any difference? So maybe we start with Celia, if you could share your.
Yeah,
Please.
I think one topic would be poverty. Poverty would still be a very important issue in the South and probably not as much in the North. So I think the priority given to certain issues would differ. And that's why it's very important that the South is able to incorporate its agenda, research and policy agenda in the discussions. And so for instance, I think with the pandemic that we're experiencing right now, some of the gains in the SDG indicators would have been reversed, and poverty definitely would have risen in many countries, including the um, developed countries. But there would be, I think, bigger changes or bigger um, reversals in the South. So poverty is definitely one of them, and this is one area where there could be more discussions among the Southern-based institutions to be able to address this particular problem. How do you recover from this pandemic in terms of being able to lift the millions have fallen into poverty, and there's not enough. Of course, we're still grappling with how to reopen the economy, but we now have to think about, okay, how do you move those who have fallen into poverty out of poverty in by 2030, if we were to meet the SDG target of eradicating poverty by 2030. And if I may, I just want to also add that I think having a national research agenda, I think the task of think tanks would be to bring it up or raise it to the level of the regional and global level, to have it incorporated at that level. And one way to do that is really for Southern think tanks to participate more actively in global and regional dialogues that are organized by the UN and other multilateral organizations and groups such as the think tanks and civil societies program. I think when the Southern based think tanks are able to converse with each other, then they have they discover that they have the same issues and are given a stronger voice. But it's also important for these Southern based institutions to converse with those in the with Northern institutions. And I think that's where we can have share different perspectives and come up with a global research and policy agenda, not a Southern driven agenda, but really a global agenda. So perhaps I can stop at this point.
Thank you. What I take from you is that there's many levels. I mean, this is the allocation of developmental aid, which is a minute proportion actually of investments in our countries, is one discussion. And I think this is going to be, and you can chip in. This is going to be less and less relevant, I guess, over time. They remain important institution. But let's not forget that, if you just take remittances, flows, they're much higher, or foreign direct investment flows in countries. So there were many think tanks that were sort of shaped and built around this idea of influencing the dialogue at the global level, which I think is more setting priorities than setting a research agenda that is useful and that can make a difference for our citizens on the ground. So I'm not saying they're not important, but they're both important. But my take is that at the local level in the end, and maybe a question for you, Ernest, is how can we make a difference to people, at the university, how you can train the future policymakers and researchers that will be able to have the necessary autonomy, like Andrea was mentioning, the necessary freedom, the detachment that you need to shape up the agenda. So maybe, Ernest, if you can tell us a little bit, share your perspective on that. And actually, there's a question from Felix that is around this idea, which is saying, as a northern-based development economist, what do you think are the best way to get in touch to collaborate with southern-based peers? So, this idea of partnership rather than a sort of strong opposition between North and South, which is, I would say, a bit of a caricature in the end. So, Ernest, please, if you can share your perspective.
Thank you very much.
And then we'll have Yamini on this topic.
Yeah, the questions from Felix and Ferdinand, they sort of complement each other very well. It takes, and the response to it is basically the context matters. The type of research you do with the intention of influencing policy, with the intention of influencing what interventions may be made in any economy, any society at all, context matters. When a Southern-based researcher is leading research, he or she is influenced considerably by the context, by the local situation. It means that the priorities for him or her are very different from the priorities of the Northern-based researcher. And you can see it whether in the area of food security, you can see it in health, you can see it in education, you can see it in climate change. I gave the example of malaria research earlier. We've been doing vaccine research for malaria for more than 3 decades. There are many, many Northern-based researchers that have worked on malaria vaccine for many years and then have moved on to other things. Because they have not been located in the South, the importance that they attach to it is very different. The incentive they have for pursuing it over a long period is very different. So context matters. A Southern-based researcher working on malaria is much more likely to be consistent in the pursuit of the vaccine. That's how I tend to look at it. You can look at it again in the area of climate change. What will work best in Africa? What will work best in South Asia, and so on. It matters a lot. So nobody can argue that Northern contributions are important. Yes, they are very important. So we emphasize the need to work together. So if, as Felix wants to know, Northern-based institutions want to work with the Southern-based, it's simply a matter of pursuing this as an equal partnership. How do we engage? How do we dialogue on finding what is most important, what is most urgent, and deal with these things with the understanding that the Southern-based researchers are much more likely to have a higher incentive to dwell on it until a solution is found. So there are many institutions in the South. They are strong ones and they are not so strong ones. How does a Northern-based institution find a strong Southern partner to work? It's fairly easy. That's why networks like GDN are important. Networks like GDN are able to broker relationships. They bring us all together. And as they bring us together, we are able to see who will be a best fit in any arrangement. So context matters. Collaborations are important. Priorities setting are very, very important in making these things work.
Sorry.
Karim, I think you were muted, so we didn't hear what you were saying.
I just offered Yamini to share with us her perspective.
Thank you. I think so just a few things to add to what Ernest has already said. I think one of the challenges that we confront in this sort of North-South narrative is that often the assumption is that the collaboration between North and the South is one where the technical expertise, the skill sets, the ability to ask the question, etc., all located up here, And then, down there is going to do the implementation. So we are convenient partners to make the world look like there's collaboration and participation. But very rarely does the starting point of the conversation what question should I, as a skilled Northern development economist, be asking that is relevant to your country? The question always is, what best way will you implement my research question so that I can get published in a peer-reviewed journal abroad? So the incentive structure within academia, both globally and both in the North and in the South, create a context of a deep power asymmetry. And I actually find that the most meaningful and useful North-South collaborations are when the technical expertise and in-country institutions come together to say, let us collectively think through how best to ask the question, of what is the question that is on your mind, that you think from your experience is the most critical bottleneck, or what hypothesis do you want to test in order to be able to move policy in a particular direction in your context. When these questions come together, and when we say we want to learn from the globe about X, and that expertise is brought in and it's a genuine participatory collaboration, magic happens. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to produce a research paper that will get published in the American Economic Review. So there is, and by the way, this is not just northern, even southern countries face this challenge, because a lot of researchers receive their legitimacy from demonstrating that they can publish in global peer-reviewed articles. And eventually, therefore, the kind of question that they're asking will get very, very limited and narrow to the particular trend that is in that discipline in development economics around the globe. So there has to be a much, much more open and candid conversation between academia in the North and academia in the South, between institutions in the North and institutions in the South, to really ask ourselves, how do you change the incentive structure in a way that you're actually producing research that is of direct relevance to the country context in which you are? It is not useful necessarily to have a randomized control trial on a very tiny little thing that may give you a really good publication. Whereas as in my developing country, I'm trying to deal with the sociological context within which an education program is being implemented. My question may be completely different, but the researcher will come and answer only that particular thing. So I think that we have to put this question of North-South into this larger incentive context of incentives. I know that this is a challenge, particularly also when we talk about multidisciplinary research. And we really need to ask ourselves, how do you build a knowledge environment, a knowledge ecosystem that genuinely believes that good knowledge is knowledge that will help countries make change with high quality, sophisticated technical analysis, rather than the current inversion where high quality technical, sophisticated analysis is more important than the question you're asking. So that's one thing I wanted to put on the table. The second thing that I wanted to put on the table was, actually we need to document, and perhaps Andrea, Southern Voice, or even GDN could partner to do this. There are many really good examples of evidence innovation that take place in Southern contexts or in countries. Let's get away from this North-South narrative. And these actually do get shared across, and there are civil society networks and collaborations that share expertise and build bodies of work around these issues. But they remain limited within particular sectors, particular networks of organizations. But sometimes funders bring organizations together so knowledge gets shared, but mostly it sort of stays in silos. We need to document these and bring them out onto the agenda to recognize the importance and value of learning from each other. I think we forget that in the chaos of our everyday and the battles that we are fighting in our own context. So, I have one example that I want to place here. We work I work very closely with an NGO in Delhi called Pratham that works on education. That has, I think, played a very important role in shaping global debates on education by pushing the agenda that they learned in India working in the grassroots, that you can keep saying universal education is your goal, so you put up schools, you hire teachers, but it is what happens in the classroom that matters. How do we fix learning outcomes? And they built based on what they understood of the context in which they were. One of the most powerful evidence tools that exists, I think, called the ASAR tool, that is an annual survey of learning outcomes in the country. And then South Asia picked it up. Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Africa has picked it up. There are ASARs everywhere. So when we have the opportunities to actually learn from each other, a lot of magic can happen. We don't document these opportunities well enough, and therefore we don't know necessarily outside of the limited sectors in which this is happening that these collaborations are possible. So more documentation, I think, will help a lot in building these collaborations moving forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Yamini. I think we answered the question of Dinesh Tapa had the question. I think you did answer it. It was a question from Francesco Bino asking, is there a global research agenda? Are they an extension of national research agenda, and how are they different? Maybe we can ask Celia.
Yes. I think the global research agenda might be broader. They're not exactly the same, because the concerns of one country may not be reflected, may not be the concern of many countries. So for instance, there are certain countries experiencing specific issues like conflict, or security issues that may not, probably that's not a very good example, but a specific issue that may not affect a lot of countries. So it's possible that there could be some differences. But I think what is very important is that we know to which areas or groups of populations these particular concerns are relevant. The global agenda may not be relevant to all countries, but may be relevant to many countries. I think we have to put that distinction, so that at the same time that we have a global agenda, we also have to be sure that the local think tanks are also aware of the national agenda. We need to cater also to more specific concerns that may be relevant only to a particular country. I just want to add to what has been said earlier in terms of capacitating researchers. I think what we would want is not just for the Southern researchers to ask the questions, but also to interpret the results and make recommendations, because sometimes the recommendations have to take into account the local context. And so it's very important that Southern researchers are also involved in crafting the recommendations. And so I think capacity building of researchers, perhaps by research networks, would be very important. And I would just like to cite that the Partnership for Economic Policy does that kind of mentoring, providing the tools and techniques that the Southern-based researchers can actually apply to answer the specific question that's relevant to the country, and also to interpret the results and make recommendations. Thank you.
What will be your assessment of, there are several institutions actually that were created to sort of deal with those market failures, deal with these imbalances of, in the research, setting up the research, the funding of the research, etc. GDN is one example actually of sort of trying to circulate this knowledge and to open up space to Southern voices, which I think they've done a great job. But there are other, institutions in Africa, etc. What would be your sort of assessment today, decades after these institutions were created? Are they delivering? Are you, Do you think they are at the right level? There are also think tanks that are northern think tanks, actually, if I may say so, that are specializing in sort of the issue we're talking about here, and based in, you know, advanced economies, capitals that are sort of advocating for, you know, development finance, different ways of doing things, etc. What's your take on that? Does it allow for, you know, to answer the main question of this panel, the development, the emergence of a Southern-based research development agenda, which is sort of carried by countries of the South and delivering for their population? So maybe Andrea, would you say something on that? What's your, you know?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that just before to connect with the previous discussion and then to connect to the institutional arrangements in place, I think that one important aspect to this Southern led research, and one point that I think we need to add into the discussion of context and relevance and connection to policymakers and so on, is the issue of agency. I think that what is important for Southern-led research is that the questions are seen through the lens also of what do we do to solve these problems. And I think, and this brings me back to the second question about the institutional arrangements around these topics. Many times when we see research from the global north, some of these institutions that Karim has mentioned, they may be in relevant issues for the global south, like poverty, let's say, like Celia mentioned, an important topic for the global south. But the questions, the way we ask them, or they ask them, are about how would we help, right? How does the cooperation system, and then we go back to Yamina's comment about philanthropy. It's about how giving supports this problem, not about how this problem is solved by the actors that are in place carrying on the solutions. So I think this is something different from the global south, that we need to think about how actors in the global south, and ask the questions about how actors in the global south are proactive about solving and tackling some of these problems. And I think that the issue of vaccines was something that is a good example in this sense. A lot of the research, the discussions that we heard in the global north was about distribution. How are we going to, have this big, massive, centralized thing that we're going to send vaccines everywhere? Actually, some of the most interesting questions that I heard from the global south was, why have we been diminishing the capacity to produce vaccines in the global south? How is it that vertical funds like Gavi, by being more efficient, are deleting the market for vaccines, and so plants and factories in the global south cannot compete, and so we don't have the capacity anymore? So the issue is kind of like the same, but the way we're approaching it is different. And I think that is my main take, and my main thing where I think that we need to make a difference, and where I think that that some of these institutions, like you're saying, that are based in the global north, but that are do research on issues related to the global south, are not well placed to take that role forward.
Maybe Ernest and Yamini after on this topic.
Yeah. So your question is, what has been the effect of all the initiatives sort of build capacity to strengthen the global, the Southern contribution to global discussions? And one example that I often give is the African Economic Research Consortium, AERC, which has been around for about 30 years, basically with the objective of building capacity in Africa to contribute to policy debates in various countries and so on. In my view, it has made the biggest impact in policy making in the region in those 30 years. In these 30 years, I've watched how in almost every African country, the number of people that can contribute to policy debates and policy analysis and so on has grown. I've seen how central banks have been changed. I've seen how treasuries have been transformed. What it tells me, and from what I see, the kind of situation we had 30 years ago, where as countries pursued economic reform, they had to rely almost exclusively on Northern economists, Northern researchers, the World Bank, IMF, to guide policy making. Today, there's a much more different environment. There's more local debate, there's more local context in the kinds of policies that are around. So yes, there has been some transformation. Yes, the development of think tanks in the region has made a significant change to how policies are made. GDN, again, is also an example. PEP, I've heard Celia talk about PEP. PEP is also a very, very good example of how capacity has been built and how local debates are very different from today from what they were 30 years ago. So it is possible. It is possible to use larger bodies outside of any one country to transform the various countries. We have examples of what works and what may not work. I've given you good examples, but there are also other examples of effort to build capacity that have not worked. So we need to pay some attention to what makes the effective ones function properly and what makes the less effective ones also not function as well as they should be. There was earlier a question of how should the research agenda in the South relate to the research agenda globally. I don't believe that there is a global research agenda. Indeed, the reason why we're having these debates is that there isn't any focused global research agenda. Most of what we see as research dominated by the global North is basically the work of individuals supported by organizations that we've seen more or less pushed onto the South. So individuals go to the World Bank or individuals go to foundations and ask for support to do their research. And these things get supported. But there is no real global research agenda. And by the same token, I haven't seen much that I can call a Southern research agenda. Many countries in the South suffer from the absence of a coordinated position on research. The research that takes place there is not really driven by a particular Southern coordinated interest, a national interest. If there was a national interest, we'll be seeing more governments in the South spending more and more on research, more and more on the development of the research agenda. So what this tells me that now as think tanks, now as universities, we have a huge new opportunity to try and encourage our governments to think in a more coordinated manner about research and therefore develop a Southern research agenda that is useful for our countries and also useful for the regions. And by that, we will see a more coordinated response from the North, which will lead to a global research. Today, we are working with the SDGs. Can anybody explain to me or to us how the SDGs were arrived at? What research led to that? There was no coordination of that. We are doing it because our instincts tell us it's the right thing to do. So let us use these opportunities like this conference to begin to influence the setting of a new agenda for research for the globe and also for our countries.
There's a link to that, maybe before Yamini, you say you share your perspective. There's link to that. There's a question from Ramona on the funding, what role it plays, of course. So here you have it on your screen.
Do you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, you can say a few words and then Yamini if you want.
Yeah, sure.
No, and maybe whoever wants to say a few words about it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ernest.
Funding has always been very important. And because funding has been used to support particular themes, particular subjects, so you find that those who have supported research throughout the South have always had what they call the priority areas. So it can be whatever foundation, they determine what their areas of priority are going to be. And anybody who needs funding from them will have to work in those priority areas. The problem for us in the South is that many of those areas have not been our own priorities. So because of our funding need, we have responded to calls that may not have been our first choice. And that's how the dichotomy between funding and actual research agenda has been. How do we change that? And I hope that this discussion will lead to new thinking about how do we prioritize, how do foundations, how do funding agencies begin to prioritize, focusing more on the local context, more on the needs of developing countries.
Yamini, then Andrea, then Celia on these two questions. Go ahead.
Thanks. Since we are, since the purpose of this conversation is to generate debate and dialogue, I'm going to take the liberty of being provocative, because I think we are skirting around a very fundamental issue and we need to bell the cat. Ultimately, all of this is actually a discussion of power and where is power located, and how people respond to power. And if we don't recognize that head on, we will continue to have this conversation into eternity. The power of resources, the power of the hegemony of ideas, the power of who's shaping those ideas, ultimately is the ecosystem within which this conversation is taking place. So I think it's important for us to be candid and clear about this. And it impacts everything in very simple ways, just for the sake of argument and provocation. Imagine a world where COVID had been restricted to a few developing countries, and the United States, Europe, the United Kingdom had not been badly affected by COVID. Would we, in 1.5 years, have a vaccine? Imagine a world where, even in the current world, how much scope and space was there in the few global institutions that chose to take a role, particularly WHO, in recognizing the complexities of the kind of mandate they were giving in the early days of COVID. I am of the view that India chose to go down that mandate of locking down the entire country way too early and at a huge cost that we are going to continue to pay for many, many decades to go. Did we at any point ask whether there should be other country perspectives in what we need to do? It's very easy to say that there's many that government could have given lots of subsidies. Of course, those are questions and issues that our democracies need to resolve internally. But what did the global community actually look to ask what would be an appropriate response for what kind of context, and tailor their advice in ways that will be useful and relevant to the places, to the diversity of the globe that was experiencing a pandemic? It didn't. It looked at it from one particular perspective and pushed it. Did the global world actually respond even financially to the nature of the pandemic? And look where we are now. The Western world is opening up, and large parts of the developing world are dealing with vaccine inequalities. So I think it's important for us to recognize that these discourses are taking place in the context of deep power asymmetries. The only ways in which we can reclaim and shift the dynamics of these narratives is to be open and candid about the power dynamic and push back really hard. It surprises me a lot. Most of my training and work has been in social policy. But in my role as president of a multidisciplinary think tank, I have to often engage with discussions on foreign policy and international relations. And it surprises me again and again that, in our discussions on power, we don't actually talk about this huge power asymmetry around the developmental discourse. International diplomacy isn't talking about local issues in ways that actually are shaped ultimately. So, everyone will pay lip service to the idea of the SDGs, etc. But look at the power dynamics that have shaped them and the power dynamics of funding and resources in them too. So I don't have any answers, but I do think that it's good to bell the cat once in a while and be provocative and ask ourselves whether or not we should highlight this power question much more frontally in our discourses to really come to an appropriate answer.
Andrea and then Celia, shorter answers as we're closing to the end.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Yamini, and that's basically our reason to exist, to try to change this discourse, power dynamics, and I think that what is also critical within this is how do we engage in these discussions about power in such a way that they enable that candid and valuable conversation, right? And I think in that sense, going back also to Ernest, previous discussion about the disconnect between the global and the local, we need this translation of what is being discussed at the global level and what is being discussed at the local level. And for the researchers, the policy actors on both sides of the spectrum to take this approach of trying to really understand each other instead of talking through each other, which happens a lot when we bring together research that is more based on global issues at the global stage. And I think with as much as the SDGs are very contested, they help with that possibility of building a bridge and building a connection between discussions. Not that we don't have to be critical about them, but they do open the doors. But I totally agree that we need to have these more candid discussions.
Thank you, Andrea. Celia?
Yes, I think networks such as the GDN and other such networks can actually help towards formulation of a global research agenda that's relevant also to the South. But I think that the challenge really is in implementing this research agenda, and the fact that donors may have certain priority areas would actually mean that certain themes in that research agenda would not be carried out because there's no funding to carry out those particular research themes. So I think that's the challenge, and I echo Ernest's call that perhaps the conference this week and the forum today would actually help come up with some ideas in terms of how to come up with a research agenda that's relevant to all, and also how to implement that particular research agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. 30 seconds each if you want to say a few words of conclusion. Let's start with Ernest, then Andrea, then Yamini, then Celia. Please go ahead. Ernest.
Well, let me thank Gideon for the opportunity to join this forum. I really enjoyed it. In going away, it's my hope that we will think more broadly about the type of work we do, with the understanding that working in small corners in our countries will not make us as effective as we would like to be, or would need to be, and that we need to think creatively about working with others like us, working in different institutions, working in different disciplines, working in different countries. So long as we share the same beliefs, the same vision about transformation, we should be able to make a difference. I believe strongly in networking, and I believe that GDN is cut for that, and let's support GDN to do it. Thank you, Yamini. Andrea, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, Karim. I would like to echo Ernest's comment and say, it would be, it feels like we could be having this conversation even if we are from different continents. We could be having it over coffee as friends, and it would be great. So it just comes to show how there is a space for the concept of the global South and a Southern-led agenda. And I think that's the great value of spaces like GDN and this conference.
Just to say thank you for giving us to GDN for this platform to have this really, really important dialogue. And Andrea's Southern Voice is proof of concept of how important it is to have collaborative platforms for engagement. And more power to you, and more power to us all to be able to come together and work for a more equitable global governance discourse.
Yeah, I'd also like to thank GDN for providing us this platform to converse with each other. And we hope that we will be able to continue this conversation towards a Southern-led policy and research agenda. Thank you.
So many thanks to all, Celia, Yamini, Ernest, and Andrea. It's been a great discussion. Thanks to GDN to have gathered us together. And to our audience for their questions, and apologies for those questions we were not able to answer due to time. But of course, this is just I guess a step and in what should be a year-long sort of permanent cycle of discussions. And thank you again to all of you, and have a great end of day. Many thanks.
Bye.